You're back in the bluff with Studio 771. It's your host, Charles Barjon. And today we're going to have a talk about the deficit, debt, and Democrats with special guests Caleb Holmes and Kelvin Wells. Introduce yourselves.
I'll go first. My name is Caleb Holmes. I'm an organizer with Step Up Louisiana. Was the former president of 771 and a proud graduate of Southern University.
Yes, Kelvin. Oh, he got applause. Y'all fancy. I'm Kelvin. I was also in the 771 Alliance, a member when this podcast actually like came about. I'm a 2019 alumnus of Southern University from the Political Science and National Relations Department. I'm currently second year Masters of Public Administration student at LSU. Yeah, so that's what I do these days.
Cool. All right. We have our fancy effects one more time. And we're just gonna get right into it, really. We're gonna start off just with immediate reflections of the post-Trump uh, democracy, if you want to call it that. What were your thoughts going into Biden's presidency, and where was your mind at leaving Donald Trump's leadership? We'll start with Caleb.
Oh, why me? Um, ooh, uh, I very excited to see Trump leave. On the same exact hand, however, on the flip side, I wasn't very confident in a Joe Biden government, and 2 months in, my confidence is even weaker going forward. Looking at 2022, most cases you're gonna lose seats regardless, and with a extremely thin majority in the House, and extremely thin majority in the Senate, I'm already looking at not only is 2022 where we're already underwater. I'm looking at another 2010 style wipeout with the way policy has been going, and 2024 makes me worried because um, people have essentially said, okay, well, Trump is gone. I can go back to sleep now. And I've always said, the next Trump won't be as dumb.
I actually like that analogy. It's like now that Trump is out of the office, people want to go back to sleep politically, and I guess in their social awareness. What would you say, Kelvin?
I would argue that we're not in a post-Trump America yet, for the simple fact that he's the most popular Republican figure as far as voting goes since Ronald Reagan. Um, and also the philosophies and the 4 years of ignorance, to use politically correct terms, ignorance and hatred and racism and all the other forms of discrimination that he encouraged and brought from America's latent opinion to America's expressed opinion hasn't gone anywhere. I would argue like, and I've had this discussion in my American Political Thought seminar, um, uh, that when we look at events like January 6th, I don't think those were the end of anything. I think those were more so the beginnings of something. Because as racial resentment continues, and as the emboldened minority that Donald Trump uh, drew his support from, like those people didn't go anywhere. Those 70s plus million people just didn't disappear when Trump left office. They still believe the same things. Um, we're not in a post-Trump America yet. And also, I don't think Donald Trump isn't so much the problem as a symptom of the problem that persists in this country. I think when we talk about a post-Trump America, we're giving ourselves credit, or we're giving America credit for progress that she hasn't made.
Mhm.
Um,
I can say that. I
all we
can
did
agree with
was change the people in power. The systems and institutions remain largely the same. So I wouldn't even use the term post-Trump
Right.
America.
I can
I don't
agree with
think
that
that's a thing.
because I'd say even socially you can see that because I'd say I guess I'd differ and argue when you say like the points of racism. I'd say racism has been something around and it's been something slowly growing to where we saw it in Donald Trump's. I think the racism, the let's call it the virus of racism within America only got stronger with Donald Trump. It was almost like a catalyst for that virus, but I'd say that in this time, I'd have a mixed opinion. I'd say that people are socially sleeping. I'd say their awareness and I'd say their care and their attention to politics is starting to fade. The day-to-day operations of, congressional I don't know what to call it, congressional just hearings and just them doing their job. People aren't paying attention to that daily anymore. I'd say that with Biden, people have this sense of relief and they have a sense of normalcy. But I think that that is a dangerous mindset to have, considering with the potential economic and environmental disaster that can come without watching Biden closely. So, and with that, I want to directly talk about what happened after Trump left, and that's the insurrection. And when I after he left, he was still in office, but the insurrection that happened at our Capitol, and what were your initial reactions to that?
Would you rather me go first or?
Sure.
Uh, I think so. For me, a lot of the I don't want to sound like clairvoyant or anything, but like uh, because of the way at least I've looked at politics around the world, it has kind of been taking what has happened around the world and throughout history and applying it to America and seeing can these very same thing happen here. And I was definitely shocked by January 6th, but I wasn't like in horror. It was like the far right, and it's not even proto fascism at this point. It's just outright fascism under the American name. Um, you know, these things have been coming. We saw this in Europe throughout the early parts of the 2010s, and when it finally came to American shores, you know, the right embraced it. Liberals, were trying to obfuscate and pretend that it was something that it wasn't, and the left, was kind of sounding the alarm and saying, "Hey, hey, it's here." And it all came, it was all organized in plain view. I mean, what we have extreme right wing figures in the police force and the military, and these aren't new things. I mean, what was it? Timothy McVeigh was some white nationalist far right person, and this happened in '95 or in the '90s. So these people have kind of been here plotting, and it's not like it came out of nowhere. It's been right under our nose the entire time. It just takes willing to look at ourselves and realize, wait, we are no different than all of the horrors that have happened throughout the 20th century. If anything, we're in prime territory for the very same things to happen because we don't remember, or we don't take the courage to stand up and look at what happened and acknowledge it can happen here and it is happening here.
Yeah, out of as far as January 6th goes, I wasn't surprised at all because I mean, if you think about it, these are the same people who in 1860, ideologically speaking, who in 1860 like seceded from this country and fought a war against America for the right to keep their slaves. So it's nothing more than history repeating itself. It looks different, just because we can all see it instantaneously now with the benefit of modern technology. And once again, I think that anyone who was found themselves in total awe and shocked, and this is beyond this country, and how could we, hasn't studied our history very closely. This isn't new. This is like this isn't something that came, like Caleb said. This didn't come out of left field. Um, this has happened before, and so it wasn't um like it no it wasn't like states seceding and waging literal war against America, but this time it was people waging war against the institutions that are constitutionally mandated in this country. The textbook definition of sedition is to use violence or threats of violence or insurrection to stop the government from functioning, um, and that's no different than seceding from the Union, which is another act of treason, and waging war to kill your countrymen. There were people in Washington, in D.C. on the 6th, who literally were looking for members of Congress to kill them. So like this isn't something we haven't seen, and so anyone who was shocked again not only hasn't studied or hasn't paid attention to our history very closely, but also as I said earlier, um, And anyone who was shocked, I mean, history repeats itself. Obviously, America, anyone who's shocked is giving us credit for things we haven't done yet. One of the reasons why we saw such a huge backlash after Reconstruction in this country is because after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, the Reconstruction that happened looked nothing like the Reconstruction that Abraham Lincoln wanted to do. In fact, like slave owners and plantation owners were reimbursed, got reparations for the value of the property. And I use that term very loosely, obviously, that they had lost, and they were just allowed to return and set up shop in the government again and pass all these laws and all these discriminatory laws and such. And so naturally, here we are again after progress has been made, or after America, a moral reckoning in America, so to speak, with the loss of Donald Trump's losing the election. After another moral reckoning, there's backlash again, and it's expressed nearly the same way. One interesting moment of irony and symbology was when the Confederate flag flew under the Capitol Dome in the United States Capitol building. Like that, people were saying how horrible that is. I'm like, but that's not the first time. Like those ideas, the ideas that are espoused by that flag have been in that house for 200 something odd years. This is just more visually jarring. And as African Americans and as students of these institutions, we find ourselves, of course, more sensitive to these things just because we're more educated on them than perhaps people who don't have degrees.
I would even question if it's education or if it's really an awareness of it, because as you two are sitting here, it's giving me your explanations. I was thinking these people, I'm starting to see how they can have such pride in their Confederate flag. They almost take it beyond their culture and they apply it to the nation itself. It's almost like they don't separate the idea of there being a United States of America versus the Confederacy in that sense. And when you're given that symbolism of Abraham Lincoln, it's almost as if they saw Donald Trump's, downfall as an assassination of their dream, what people call, the Great White Hope or the South rising again, and all these little one-liners you hear in memes and in jokes. It's almost as if they have a cognitive dissonance as in what is the actual reality of this country and the reality of the direction of the nation and what they actually feel and what they're actually choosing to accept, which is
and
quite interesting.
Um, I would just, and I don't think it's necessarily more um, degrees or not, but I definitely think, from occupying spaces that, would kind of excuse these things growing up in school, it is just a pure lack of the willingness to just look at America for what it is. I mean, pretending as what is the war of northern aggression and oh it was fought oh the civil war was fought over economics, like it was slavery. It is the consequence of race in this country, and the more that we try to dance around it and pretend like no that wasn't the case, the more we're doing ourselves a disservice, we're doing our kids a disservice. um you know One of the things that I even had to make the distinction of, the people who went up to the Capitol that day, they went further than Joe Blow in West Virginia, who's economically poor and has a right to be angry. I mean, his wealth has been stolen from him, but to take it to the point of going to the Capitol and trying to overthrow the government in the name of a legitimate election that was attempted to be rigged in the Republican Party's favor, is just something that we can't forgive. I mean, there's a difference between, proverbially taking back our government from the wealthy, the powerful, and the well connected, and trying to take back a government that was, in spite of voter suppression, and in spite of racism and distractions from the issues, was legitimately elected. And you know, uh, it's just it's completely inexcusable, and to try to like pin this, um it's more disgusting for me because it is a complete murder of the truth. And as someone who tries to seek out the truth as much as possible, recognizing that there's bias and everything, but there is a simple truth, whether we like it or not. And the simple truth is, you know, the truth isn't always found in the middle, and it's not always found in compromise. But the truth is, this country is teetering on the edge of something extremely dangerous. And, one side of the political spectrum has fully embraced fascism and anti-democracy, and then there's another side pretending as if that's not what's going on, and it is, and it's really dangerous. I mean, I hate to draw the parallels and you know sound hyperbolic, but I mean this is very similar to Weimar Germany. I mean, the interwar period in Europe. I mean, these things, of course, they're not the exact same, but the similarities are all there, and it would serve well that we've learned these lessons, and hopefully we don't have to repeat them to learn them again. Because I sure as hell don't plan on reliving through another world war.
Right. And then also, just to make that segue into the broader conversation, when we look at race in America, we also look at how politics has played a major role in polarizing Black against white, and then in the same way, red against blue. How are you two viewing the major parties in America, Republican and Democrat, in 2021?
So I think, well, first of all, what we're seeing, as far as what we saw with January 6th and what we're seeing as far as political polarization in this country, are also not new things. Well, one, because when you think about January 6th, you have to like contextualize, so to speak, the anger that we saw, because the issue wasn't that, as some people would erroneously say, the issue wasn't that, oh, these people didn't feel heard. They were upset because, in spite of every attempt to silence uh, people who they didn't want heard, primarily African Americans. If you look at the votes that changed, the votes that flipped these states, they came from predominantly urban centers with high percentage of African American voters, in Atlanta, in Philadelphia, in Phoenix, and so their anger wasn't that they weren't heard. The anger was that there are other voices in the room, and that for one of the few times in American history, um, I won't, well, yeah, I won't say one, well, yeah, but one of the few times in American history, not only were these voices heard, but these voices were loud enough to bend, to change outcomes. And so naturally, as we've seen in the history of this country, whenever any marginalized group, particularly African Americans, has their voices heard and effects change, there's an immediate backlash. Professor Cottrell at Southern often would put it this way: we take 2 steps forward and we have to take 10 steps back because we get pushed back, because there's always even today, literally hours ago, the Georgia State Senate passed uh, some of the most like egregious violations of voting rights. Well, they won't be violations if they make them law, but some of the most egregious challenges to voting rights. And that's in response to the organizing, to the activism, and also to the turnout that was garnered, especially among African Americans, by Stacey Abrams and others, the other people that she worked with, other political leaders and activists and grassroots organizers in the state of Georgia. And so the polarization we're seeing is, as Caleb said, it's a result of, I wouldn't say we've learned the lessons, because if we had learned the lessons, then history wouldn't have to repeat itself. But it's with America's one, there's this belief of American exceptionalism, that this country is somehow different and better. And what American exceptionalism then requires us to do, what requires those who believe in it to do, is to ignore America's sins and wrongdoings without addressing them and bringing them, calling them what they are. Uh, and so until America reckons and looks in the mirror and sees herself for what she is and stops folding her robes to hide the stains, we're going to continue to see the same polarization, because a lot of the issues people are polarizing around are not necessarily controversial issues if you take them out of the American political context. People having access to healthcare, for example, is not a consequential. It's not a consequential, not a controversial topic outside of the American political context. If you just ask people, hey, should people have healthcare? Most people would say yes. Like that, like, is healthcare a human right? Most people would agree with that statement, would agree with the statement healthcare is a human right. Once you contextualize it in terms of the American system, then you find the rich upper class, usually white Americans, saying, "Oh, well, I don't want my money paying for those people," and you can assign whichever group you want to that eponym. Those people to I don't want to pay for those people's healthcare, or my money shouldn't have to pay for food stamps for whoever. But if you just ask people, hey, do you think the government should let people go hungry? Most people would say no until you put it in the American political context, and then all of these other ideas which are relevant are attached. So that's the issue. That's the polarization in America, is because it only comes into play when you think about who is in what position. And also, you have to think about this in 2050. By 2050, America would be a majority minority country. Um, and so, as white people and the white elites lose that power that they have over how our political system, like, it's going to happen. There's nothing they can do about it. Just, it's demographics, it's math. um, so as that continues, as that snowball makes its way down the hill, there's this panic because they're losing power, um, which is similar to what we saw in Europe with changing demographics in Europe because of refugees and people fleeing issues in other parts of the world. There all of a sudden there were all these people who look different, who are different, who sound different, and they're coming here and affecting the way we do things. They're affecting our way of life, and so we have to keep those people out. Or we have to find ways to restrict those people's power, or restrict their free movement and mobility in our society. And you can probably hear some very similar things to things we've been hearing for the last 4 years, like build the wall, and then something like 100 and something articles of state legislation across the country that would reduce voting rights and access to easier access to voting. So the polarization we see is just on some in some regards uh, is because one side of this country sees that this country has to change and think the way we do things now is unsustainable, and the other half, not half, but the other part of this country, roughly half though, other part of this country is trying so hard to hold on to this American exceptionalism and the balance of power as it has been in this country, and trying to do things the way we've always done them, and to make our country great again, uh, as was their slogan. So I think that's part of the reason why we see the polarization. Now, of course, there are some other more nuanced ideological explanations for the polarization we're seeing, but I think that's a very good way. I would think, in my semi-expert opinion, now to sum them up. So
Definitely.
So,
What are your thoughts, Caleb?
so I'm coming at this from a very similar yet different perspective. First, to some degree, I mean, Kelvin is right. They haven't learned their lessons. For me, though, what I'm seeing is kind of placing this within the context of the interwar period. What I'm seeing now is the people who have the power to make sure that this doesn't happen again either can't see or don't want to see where they're leading us. And that, for me, speaks more to the Democratic Party more than anything, that we have kind of taken the ideals of anti-racism, LGBTQ issues, equal rights, women's issues, all of these things, and these are issues we do need to have. I mean, like Kelvin said, this is becoming majority minority country, and there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, in principle, we're all Americans and should celebrate that. But one of the things that's kind of missing there is this class conversation, and I think some of the same mistakes that were made by liberals of the time in the interwar period are the same mistakes that American liberals are making, and a lot of people are starting to have this conversation between, there is a extremely and stark difference between the left and liberals, and that conversation is almost creating an impasse within the Democratic Party as to what to do to solve these issues. Because, like I said, the fascism, the far right, is here, and they're all united in what they want. The question is, what does the other side want? And excuse me. Essentially, what I'm just saying is that the Democratic Party has a choice to make, and that is, do they want to adequately solve these issues so they don't come up again, or do they just want to obfuscate and play pretty around the edges, but in reality all you're doing is just delaying the inevitable, and that is the next Trump. And God forbid that one will not be stupid, that one will not somehow bungle his own way into losing an election that, for all political purposes, you know Trump kind of could have won. I mean, it was what, only a 3.5 point, 4 point margin.
Something like that.
Um,
Yeah,
you
and
know,
so to Caleb's point, just a quick interjection. I told people for years during the Trump presidency, I said one of the things that we're not appreciating about Donald Trump that is actually helping us is that he has no formal knowledge of these systems. If he understood how like the political systems worked and how to take advantage of them, he would be infinitely more dangerous. So we complain that he's uninformed and colloquially people use the word stupid and ignorant, but we complain that he's stupid and ignorant of how to do his job. But that actually helped us in the long run get rid of him, because if he actually knew how to do his job, or at least how to make it appear as though he's doing his job, then I think the next best comparison we get, without so much of the overt racism and sexism and all the other forms of discrimination, is George Bush, who ran this country into the ground by every measurable standard uh, for 8 years, not because he knew how to do his job, but because he took advantage of America's latent public opinion. Um, and also, 9/11 happened, and wartime presidents get reelected. But he knew how to make it look like he was doing his job. So yeah. But Caleb, if you were
yeah,
not,
I'm and whether I get a lot of flack from the liberals or not, I personally don't care. But one of the things I'm concerned with is, like I said, is the party that claims to stand for all these values, are they ready to actually speak truth to power and fight back? Or are you just willing to uphold a black person or a Latino or Hispanic person or an Asian or LGBTQ person up in these upper echelons of power, but in actuality they're still serving a system that kind of gets you to where Trump is today, and that is, the capitalist system at large. And I don't know if the Democratic Party is ready to necessarily abandon it. And I'm not saying that they should. If they found fruit in that, I guess go ahead with it. But that kind of implicates the rest of the country along with it. And I live here too. So um that really begs the question, we've gotten rid of Trump for now. But someone, well, not someone, but as it was said, is what happens when the Democrats don't have Trump to blame? Um, it kind of falls back on them and how they're implicated in the same exact system and allowing it to get to this point. Um,
I could agree with that because sitting here, I'm thinking, just like how you said, how long will they continue to boost African American person, Latino person, this person, that person, when fundamentally it's the party that needs to change and the party that needs to evolve? When will we see the Democratic Party actually progress to meet the needs of its new, I don't even know how to say, not inquirers, but its voters, the people who support the actual party? uh, I'd say the Democratic Party is old and its rhetoric is old and how it relates to the people, and the people have changed since. So if we're gonna have a blue wave or this blue party, the party itself needs to attend to the voters. And speaking of that, we can't speak of America without speaking of economics. I mean, this country itself was founded upon an economic rift with its parent. So how is it exactly, you have these semi-experts here. How do you two see America's economy, and then if you can add in there the black dollar within America, and how we as a people ourselves, being that we're at HBCU, can better ourselves?
yeah.
Good
Um,
question. Take your time.
well, I can make this distinction first. When it comes to like the black dollar, I I can say right out, I'm not a capitalist, and I don't support this myth that that we need black investment and black businesses and da 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 da. Like that's all fine and dandy, that's great, but that still doesn't solve the actual issues. All you've just done is put a pretty face on an oppressive system. Colloquially, I kind of use the term. I always tell people, do you want a white man pissing on your head, or do you want a black person pissing on your head, or would you rather not have anyone pissing on your head? And most people of common sense would probably take the third option. Um, but what I think at large for America's economy is all what I'm really seeing is capitalism doing what capitalism does best, and that is protect the interest of private owners of the means of production. And all we're doing right now, frankly, is just dressing it up with people of color and marginalized communities, but not actually willing to stand in its face and just say this system does not work. I mean, it's almost incompatible to delivering what people need: housing, shelter, uh, both of those things, food, healthcare. I mean, the basic necessities to live a life. And capital loves to predicate on the ideas of freedom, but those all depend on the freedom to choose. I forget who it was. I think it was someone in the Labor Party in the UK. But I mean, how can you adequately choose something if you're shackled with student loans? Or how can you adequately, choose and freely choose your life if you're being shackled with medical debt or the stress of medical debt? Hey, I ain't feeling well, but if I go to the doctor and them giving me, ibuprofen that I could buy for $5 at Walmart is going to cost me $500 in the emergency room. I mean, the whole notion of true freedom, I think more than anything, if as black people, what we really need to sit down and have the conversation of black capitalism is not going to save us. It might get us over the hump, real quick. But in actuality, it's still a oppressive system, just dressed up nicely to make you feel better because it's coming from someone who just happens to look like you.
So my thoughts, and I differ with Caleb here a bit. I'm also not a capitalist by any means, by any stretch of the imagination. One important distinction I want to point out: the problem with capitalism is that it works too well, not that it doesn't work. Um, that the issue with capitalism is that it works. Capitalism assumes that human beings are inherently selfish, and will in fact subjugate other humans for their own personal gain, and that is true. I don't know how you can debate that. Just look around. It happens. Like literally, one thing I always like to point out is look where people build. Like look where these large, wealthy people, large corporations and firms and wealthy people build like sports stadiums. They're usually, especially in major cities. I will never forget when I worked DNC Philly 2016. Um, how on the way to the Wells Fargo Center, like on the interstate, on the highway, we literally passed like uh this very underdeveloped, impoverished area, and then there's like some empty space and not very much, and then the Wells Fargo Center where the 76ers play, and all this, like the food attractions and all the things that come with being in that sort of like downtown area, uh and even now, uh working at LSU, like people the South Baton Rouge is like right there. Like LSU sits in South Baton Rouge, but once you enter those gates on Highland Road, you couldn't tell that one of the more impoverished parts of our city is just a 5-minute walk down the street. Like you wouldn't know that, but that's how this country operates. So it's not that capitalism doesn't work. It does work. Now, what I will say is that um what I will say, am I totally against the free market? No, I think if you have a service and you want to sell it, you should be able to do that. But I do think that the economy should be regulated in such a way that you're not trampling on other people's rights and stealing their wealth. Like, I think we should pay people the value of their labor. Like, that's just something you should do. like I'm not gonna say like, oh no, no one should own businesses. Like, no, that's insane. Which is what some people erroneously equate democratic socialism to, but it's still democratic. It's not command. Socialism is economics, not government. Um, but secondly, I think that the wealth in this country was built on the backs of African Americans. Literally, the money, the billions in today's money, in constant dollars at least, trillions of dollars in wealth that this country has, um, directly came like after slavery ended. All that money didn't just disappear. It went into firms. It became like insurance companies like New York Life, which made money off policies issued on slaves. It became universities, Georgetown University, like it became institutions. It became JP Morgan Chases and all of these other large, like that wealth didn't just disappear. And you can't systematically, I'm sorry, exclude people from the benefits of people who built that, who made that happen. You can't systematically exclude people from that for 200 years. That's just not fair. That's not how this country works. So, uh, and where I'm going with this is twofold. One, I do agree with Caleb. Black capitalism is not the answer. Like that's not a thing. That's not better. It, like he said, it looks better. You know, it makes you feel better, but it's not the answer. Now, I will say that African Americans deserve reparations in this country. Now, I'm not a proponent of cash reparations because that's impossible. There have been several economists uh, and there was one who put, he was like, if you take the value of all the labor performed by slaves and you say there were, he approximated the number of slaves, and then he was like, all right, let's assume they all worked for minimum wage and they all worked 12 hours a day. Not erroneous assumptions other than the minimum wage part. He's like, I'm not factoring in anything punitive, not factoring in like what we would call emotional distress, just the value of labor. Estimates ranging today from anywhere from 33 to 56, and it's on the higher end, over $100 trillion in labor performed by African Americans as slaves in this country. And so cash reparations doesn't work because there's not that, depending on the amount where you fall in that range, there's not that much money in the world when you get to the higher end of that spectrum. But what I do think, like, for example, should African Americans pay federal income tax? I don't think so. That's a form of reparations. Should African Americans pay uh, for public? Well, I don't think anyone should pay for school. But as far as like home loans, which I have a whole another gripe with the housing system, but African Americans should not have to pay interest on home loans, or should get priority uh, funding for like small businesses and startups, or should like, or you know, should be considered for jobs and other economic opportunities um, at a rate that matches the rate at which we were systematically excluded. So yes, that also though economically in this country, I think that the COVID pandemic did a very good job. One thing of exposing how unsustainable our current economic system is, just because we're in one now this week in 1 year of this pandemic, the United States has provided so far $1,800. And let's be nice. Let's say they pass because it's more than likely going to pass. So let's add the $1,400 stimulus. Let's say so the average person, assuming they don't have children or anything, gets $3,200 for the last year of this pandemic. That puts us near the bottom, if not at the bottom, of what other countries have done for their citizens. Some countries matched up to 100% of wages. Some countries matched like 80% of what you would have made. I know one of the more popular examples was Canada did $2,000 a month per individual, and then so much per household, or were they so much per, like 4,000 I think for couples, and then like $500 or $600 a month per child. But they've been doing that for like, I could be wrong, but maybe like 9 months, 9 up to 12 months. Um, and so here we are in the richest nation on earth, and we've gotten $3,200 in a year. And then you have politicians like Senator Mitch McConnell, about whom I have strong feelings, saying things like, if we give people $1,400, they won't go back to work. Like, I don't know anybody who, if you wrote them a check for $1,400, would say, "Yep, I'm set," and quit their job. I don't know. I don't. That just doesn't make sense. Um, But how unsustainable our current economic system is. I think now, I think definitely, um, like as far as Congress and the role politics plays in economics, I mean, as long as like money is continuing to concentrate itself in the higher percent, the upper echelons of this society, nobody's going to be in a hurry to change anything. Well, they won't be in a hurry to change anything. But I also think, as like the general populace, like we have to see that I say yes, racism is a big problem in this country, and racism and classism are inherently in this country, in the context of America, racism and classism are inherently linked, um, because part of the reason, one of the most effective strategies that wealthy capitalists used in this country was racism. When the argument was made, when they realized, like, hey, if these people ever realize that we're messing over them all the same, regardless of what color they are, then we're going to lose power, because that's how revolutions start. Um, cool. So I think that, so then you get the, well, at least you're not black, or at least you're not a Mexican, or at least you're not whatever group they wanted to exclude at the time. And that's when you see this division, so to speak. And so I definitely think, yeah, our current economic system of capitalism, not only is it not sustainable economically, but as far as holding, I don't think America's a nation, another discussion. But as far as holding this country together politically, it's also not sustainable, and it's going to actually accelerate, like the divide between the classes is going to accelerate the divide politically and ideologically that we see in this country. And that's a direct threat to our beloved democracy. So uh, something, like Caleb said, something's got to give sometime soon.
Oh,
Um,
Something's got to give. And in these last 2 minutes or so, let's just quickly touch on the topic of deficit for the namesake of the podcast, and perhaps we can schedule a part 2 and get more into depth on that. But just quickly, Caleb, what are your opinions on that? Does it even exist?
uh, it in an economic sense, it does exist. Right now, my personal, I always tell people like this: the government should not be run like your household. Here's the key difference: you, a person, cannot overnight increase your income. So if I make $3,000 a month, right? And I have a set amount of debt. And your deficit is just what you're underwater with. So if I make $3,000 every month and I spend 3,500, my deficit for that month was 500. My total debt is 500. The next month I make 3,000, but I spend 3,700. My deficit is 700, but my debt is 1,200. So debt is the accumulation of all of your what you're underwater with. The deficit is just within a current term what you're underwater with. But yeah, like I said, you cannot say, okay, well, instead of making 3,000, I'll just up my income to 5,000. You can't do that unless you just have a really good job. And if that's the case, give me a call. I would love to work there. But governments can. It's called taxes. You may not like it, but overnight they can just decide we're going to collect more revenue to cover the deficit at the current time. I am worried how much it is increasing, and I am worried to a large degree about debt in general when it's in a foreign sense. Right now, most of the debt, the $28 trillion that the United States does have, is public debt, and that can be just as dangerous. But currently, our foreign debt, money we owe to other countries, excuse me, is quite low, and they owe us just the same. So it's not like China's going to come knocking in the middle of the night asking for their money because we could pull the same card saying, "Hey, you owe us money too."
Right.
Whereas
And then
right
very
now,
quick, sorry to cut you off. We got 50 seconds. So very quickly, if you want to just rush, Kelvin, your
Yeah,
argument.
so I do think, like, yes, economically, and like both of these things, like as a student of public administration, yes, both of these things are real. Now, the degree to which they're consequential can be argued. Like the national debt, not only is it never going to be repaid, but it has very little effect on how, in case you haven't noticed, how we run this country. Now, the deficit, I do think, should be controlled to some degree. I think. Um, certainly like tax cuts for the wealthy probably shouldn't happen because those contribute to the deficit. But also when you find yourself in times of crises like these and like we did in 2010 economically, like sometimes you have to add to the deficit to make sure the country doesn't fall apart. So I think a part two would be needed though, because that's a whole different.
Definitely. Right when you said that, we cut off for the podcast, but the Zoom recording's still on. So I'll just take time to thank you guys. Thank you for coming out to this first episode. And we'll schedule a second one just so the people have these conversations and just so students here at Southern also have somewhere to look to understand these topics. So thank you again for coming out. And thank you everybody for listening.
I think. Oh, and Kelvin, just as a